Daniel McAdams, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thanks so much for having me on, Kim. Appreciate it.
Okay, so you're from California and you were telling me that you went to UC Berkeley. When I think of Berkeley, I think when anybody thinks of Berkeley, we don't think of somebody who ends up becoming a libertarian. So tell us about this. Were you always kind of were you an outsider at Berkeley at that time, or would you say that it was, or was that school even just more politically diverse back then? Not that it was
Well,
that long ago, but
well, it was a while ago, Kim. I hate to break the news, but yeah, it was a while ago. Not quite the free speech movement era, but a bit after that. But I mean, I grew up in Southern California. It was the era of punk rock and surfing and everything. And so I think everyone in those days in Southern California, or at least the people that I knew, had a little bit of rebel in them. That was just part of the game. So when I ended up at Berkeley, it was a bit of an adjustment. But being the rebel and being around, a campus dominated by a certain type of political ideology, I of course automatically went to the opposite end. And so I mean, I wasn't super political necessarily, but when I got there and saw what it was like, I immediately went to work for a right-wing school newspaper. Um, and I protested the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on the steps of Sproul Plaza. So I was just like, just being a rebel. And that's actually the time that I really learned about the intolerance of a lot of people in the left. Now, not the entirety, but I was the advertising manager of the Cal Spectrum, and that was like officially the school paper, but it was a right-wing paper.
Mhm.
And the reason why the left-wing paper wasn't the school paper is they didn't want to have the school telling them what to do. So anyway, I was the ad manager for the Cal Spectrum, and I thought, super cool job, really fun to do. And I got like the greatest ad ever, an insert from Coors Light, right? And I'm thinking, this is so great because it's going to pay for the entire at least semester of production costs. And I
Uh-huh.
was super excited about it. So all of our papers hit the stands. I got up the next morning. I couldn't wait to take a look. And the wonderful, tolerant liberals in Berkeley took every single newspaper and threw them in the trash can, because I didn't even realize that apparently Coors in those days was considered right wing. So they took our newspapers and trashed them all. So that was my experience
Wow.
there. Yeah.
And so it wasn't because of underage drinking or something. It was
That was not a problem there. Trust me.
so it was just they thought that that brand was right wing, and so they
Yeah,
trashed it.
they
Wow.
wrote on our distribution rack, boycott Coors, you racist fascist scum. So
Wow. Did you grow up as a conservative, or were you liberal? Was your house liberal? Like, is this something that shifted while you were at Berkeley just because you were like, I just want to be different?
that was probably it. Yeah, we were never super political. On both of my parents' sides, it was very blue collar Democrat. They came from they both moved out from Ohio and Pennsylvania. We have like a lot of union in the family, blue collar in the family, that kind of thing. So in those days, you grew up, you're a Democrat because the Democrats for the working man. Now, I never was. I registered Republican when I first was able to vote. But that was always ingrained in you, that the Democrats were out for the working man. And of
Right.
course, the opposite is true now. But in those days, that was the idea.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that you experienced left-wing, I guess, censorship and kind of authoritarianism back then. I was kind of under the impression that this was a new development, that this was something that just sort of cropped up probably around the time of Trump, that there's just this, such an anger and such an outlash at Trump winning the presidency, this racist, misogynist, terrible human, this, that it kind of ramped the whole, we must stop Donald Trump, or we have to stop racism. I mean, that's really right after Trump won. It was, we have to stop racism and misogyny, right? So they were going after anybody that they just thought looked racist. I mean, if you just looked at something wrong, they would say you're a racist. And then of course the Me Too movement. So there was a lot of halting racism and misogyny, but you feel like, but that, I come from a different perspective because I always came more from the left, and I've moved now independent. So maybe I just didn't see it. I grew up in Idaho, so I had a very different, everybody around me was conservative and religious on top of that. So they were actually quite authoritarian and wanting to censor and wanting people to hide their lifestyles or wanting people to hide who they are. They were they were much more, I would say, authoritarian, but that was my experience. And so I always viewed the left as being more tolerant, but you don't have that same experience.
Yeah, well, you have to remember, I'm talking about the 1980s. And the 1980s, like the intellectual ferment was like Derrida and Foucault. I mean, these were this was the origin of identity politics, of cultural Marxism. It essentially evolved into what we called at the time political correctness. Now
Hmm.
that became like a cancer that continued to grow and infect society. But essentially, what it was the Frankfurt School, was cultural Marxism, and that's how it started. And that started in the left, absolutely. So, but in those days, I mean, I was an English literature major, and in those days, everyone was reading Foucault. I mean, that was it. That's what you read, and that's what you understood, and it was all about identity politics. So I think in those, I'm sure you could trace it back earlier, but certainly in that period, that was laying the groundwork for what came later. They quietly built up their resources, so when they had a Trump in office, then they were able to really, they had captured the institutions,
Yeah.
let's put it that way.
Do you think it's just the pendulum has swung? I mean, part of me thinks that like Berkeley and these radical leftist or liberal places were really there, and they became as radical as they became because so much of the country was so conservative and authoritarian on the other side. Religiously conservative, religiously wanting to push um, certain ideology, on people, religious ideology, right? So whether you agree with it or not, but wanting to push that. Do you think that it was just the pendulum swung and it usually overcorrects, right, for a while? And then people, just like with the Me Too movement, that's a good example
Yeah.
where, okay, there were some people who really should have been called out, Harvey Weinstein, right? Bill
Mhm.
Cosby, who did way beyond, right? There were a lot of people out there that really should have been called out for this really terrible behavior. But then there were some people that it was just like a bad date,
Yeah,
and they were being called out for a bad date.
yeah. And I know people that fell victim to that, who were exonerated. Um, but San Francisco always, and I lived in San Francisco after I graduated. San Francisco always had a reputation, and you could say back from the Gold Rush era, of being a very quirky city, a very iconoclastic city. It always attracted those types of people, and so I think you see that. But in Berkeley, in the '60s, the free speech movement was aligned with the anti-war movement. And ironically, I mean, it could be a pendulum situation because initially it was conservatives that were always anti-war. I mean, the Taft wing of the Republican Party in the '50s, certainly the post-war conservative movement up until Buckley were solidly anti-war, and so they were sort of emerging. You could almost say in the '60s, between the right-wing anti-war and the left-wing anti-war movement, as sort of was captured in Berkeley, and certainly there were other campuses across the country, like Kent State for one, but others where a radical anti-war movement emerged, and so I think that was part of it.
That's interesting. So the right was anti-war and the
Always.
left was pushing war.
Well, I wouldn't. I would say they were both anti-war for a while, but then William F. Buckley hijacked the conservative movement and turned it into a pro-war movement.
Mm.
His whole philosophy is we have to adopt the approach of the communists to beat the communists. We need to create a massive national security state, all-powerful national security state, because otherwise we'll be overtaken by the Reds. And that was the destruction of the conservative movement in America. And that's why you had so many breakaways. People like Justin Raimondo, who was in San Francisco, he broke away from the right wing, the conservative movement, and he moved more toward libertarianism at that point. So you had a real break. And I'm not an expert on all of these breaks and things, but I do know there was a breakaway. And what you had left of the conservative movement, well, you see it now, Conservatism Inc. And it's it's an intellectually vapid, hollow shell of what it once was.
Hmm. Excuse me if you hear some sawing going on in the background. I have contractors here. I was hoping they would take a lunch break, but
You
but
could just
they're
say you're
but
listening to industrial music in the background.
that's right. I'm so cool. That's what it is. Um, so when you were right, I just wonder if this was like a pendulum swing, and we're seeing the pendulum swing again. I think we see the pendulum, and it just continue. And it's disheartening to be honest with you, because just when I think somebody's going to, okay, this side's got it. They finally got it. They're awakening and they're waking up to the corruption of our government or all these problems that we have in our government. But then, like the right, for example, they have been, I think, the champions of free speech for the last several years since the Donald Trump derangement really took hold. But lately, I feel like I'm seeing more censorship coming from the right. In particular, we're seeing it in full swing when it comes to the Israel-Gaza war, right? We're seeing a lot of censorship there. That one in particular has been very disheartening as far as the censorship goes. Ron DeSantis is a big censorship czar when it comes to Israel-Gaza, and others are as well. I mean, we're seeing it. So, and also I think there's Ron DeSantis, even, who I liked for a while there, especially during the COVID pandemic, then started to take on censoring books. We don't want kids to have to, wanting to control, which, and maybe there's some of that needs to happen. But again, it's a pendulum, right? It can always go too far, and then it starts to go too far. And then people start to push back on that. And even I think the judges in Florida now are starting to reverse a lot of those school book bans in Florida now, because they're saying that went a little too far, So this pendulum swinging back and forth is always, I think, something that unfortunately just seems to naturally happen. And it's interesting that, so do you think, so Berkeley has just clearly gone more and more, just continued to go further left and further authoritarian since you were there?
Yeah, I would say authoritarian. The left and right doesn't really work, I mean, one of the big problems, Kim, is the fact that we have a systemic politicization of our entire society. Politics is entirely too important. So you have a situation where the Democrats wanted to get Trump kicked off the ballot. You had highly partisan Democrats working in these positions, most of them put in power by very wealthy, left-wing activists, named George Soros. So what they did, we want to take Trump off the ballot. The conservative response was not, that is un-American. The conservative response was, oh yeah, well, we're going to take Biden off of our ballots. So you're missing the point. It's not about politics. It's about principles. Are we a free society? Or are we the kind of society where you take people off the ballot? I mean, I thought that's what we complained about Iran for, is that they have like this religious guard that, that decides who can run for the president. Well, they're adopting that same thing. So the problem really is that politics is too prevalent in our society. And one of the ways I experienced this, I spent the 90s living in Hungary. I moved there right after communism fell. And so there was a huge hangover of communism there. And I can tell you, even among families, your politics is what defined you. This side of our family, they were in the Communist Party. Oh, this side were in the opposition. And it was visceral. And I thought, thank God we're not like that in the US. But then I got home, almost 10 years later, and it became like that. So it's just, the problem is when government gets huge like that, it's a jealous God. It takes over every aspect of your society. So you have to fight for all the goods that only government, quote unquote, can provide. So that's the root of the problem.
I like that you've said that. I think you're absolutely right. It is the root of the problem that we are now. And we are so divided right now with politics. I have family members that won't speak to me because of politics. They think that I was trying to kill grandma during COVID or something. I mean, so many of us have these stories now since the election of Donald Trump. I feel like it got worse. I mean, maybe I was just blind to it previously and I didn't notice it as much, but I feel like it got a lot worse since Donald Trump, that people started to say, you voted for Trump, you're an evil person, or you vote for Biden, then you're a commie trying to ruin the country, right? And you're right, rather than it being about principles, it's about politics, and that's causing a huge, huge division in this country. And I think you're right on about that.
That's why I said back in 2006, I'm not going to vote for anyone. So I just stopped voting.
Do you vote now?
I don't vote. No, I haven't voted since 2004, I think.
You're kidding me.
No, I don't want to take any part in it whatsoever.
But I mean, voting is how you change it.
Really? My one
I would think, I would hope.
The lesser of two evils.
Well, I mean, if you and I both voted, and if we both got two people, and then those two people got two people, and it spread like that, then maybe we could make a change.
You've been watching too many of those PBS children's shows about how a bill becomes a law or something. I mean, I worked there. It doesn't work that way. But
Hey guys, be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you like this segment. Now, you might be wondering, this seems like it's part of a bigger show. You're right, it is. The full show is at KimIversonShow.com. So, what you're watching is just a clip. And if you want to get the full experience, then you got to go to KimIversonShow.com. The show airs Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. That is where you can watch the full show. Here, you just get clips. So, click on the link down below, go to the full show, enjoy. Otherwise, I'll see you next time right here. And be sure, once again, like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.